Западные территории нынешней Польши – это подарок Сталина полякам.
Tutaj za mną koledzy dają wyraz tego, że jest to protest.
For quite some time, the Kremlin has been using both right and left radicals to destabilize various states, a process that is naturally overseen by the Russian special services. Nothing unites people like a common enemy, and nothing separates people like differing goals. Let's be honest, the democratic world, having supported Kiev after the 24th of February 2022, has become habituated to this dreadful war and no longer sees a threat in the Russian army that is stuck near Avdiivka. More and more Europeans are beginning to perceive the war as a regional conflict and believe that Putin's ambitions will be contained to a defiant Ukraine. Obviously, this is a misconception, one that will inevitably lead to an even larger scale war. But the main thing is not even this, but the fact that it lulls the vigilance of the democratic world. The entire Kremlin intelligence network de facto is already waging war against this very democratic world because for Putin, Ukraine is just the first stage in his war. This should have been realized after he demanded that NATO return to the borders of 1997. This video with English dubbing, which can be played in the YouTube player, was made to remind everyone that the Ukrainians are at war with a country whose primary goal is the total destruction of the entire existing political system and to change borders according to the right of the strong. If the population of democratic countries fail to understand that the war is already against them, there is already a war. They're not partners. They are the rear of the Ukrainians sitting in the trenches. Soon they might find themselves in the trenches as well. It is crucial, friends, that you watch this video to the end and share it as widely as possible. Please, this is urgently needed now.
Западные территории нынешней Польши – это подарок Сталина полякам.
Хотят поляки быть следующими?
Война неизбежна.
Россия не остановится на Украине.
И, кстати, в Варшаве и Хельсинки приготовятся.
Это не блеф. Польшу можно поставить на колени за 1 час.
Берлин, Париж, Лондон, Брюссель готовы гореть?
Сувалский коридор в случае чего нам очень нужен.
Уничтожить Прибалтику, если так.
Граница России нигде не заканчивается.
Упреждающий удар по Франции.
В прах обратится Лондон.
Нас никто не слушал. Послушайте сейчас.
Jacek Severu, the head of Poland's National Security Bureau, stated that NATO has 3 years to prepare for a Russian attack on alliance members. I would add personally, if Ukraine falls, Polish intelligence has every reason to fear a full-scale invasion from the Russian Federation because, as I have already mentioned, a hybrid war is already happening. In this footage, a native of New Jersey, Ronaldo Nazara, walking around St. Petersburg, gives an interview to the Russian Federal Channel. On the channel, he proudly talks about his organization, The Base. The Base is a neo-Nazi group operating in the USA, the United Kingdom and Canada. In 2021, 2 members of The Base, Brian Lemley and Patrick Matthews, confessed to planning terrorist attacks as well as orchestrating the prison escape of their associate Dylan Roof, a mass murderer who killed 9 African Americans in a Charleston church. Yes, Russia is accusing Ukraine of Nazism. They are interviewing the organizer of a far-right terrorist group, but this is not surprising. For quite some time, the Kremlin has been using radicals from both the right and the left to destabilize various states. This process is of course overseen by the Russian special services. As investigators from the Dossier Center discovered, Ronaldo Nazara applied for training at the partisan military camp, which is located near St. Petersburg. This camp is quite interesting. It belongs to an organization called the Russian Imperial Movement, which has been designated a terrorist organization in the United States. This was due to their training of militants and dispatching them to the Ukrainian Donbass in 2014, but it doesn't stop there. Neo-Nazis from other countries also received training at the Camp Reed. In 2017, an improvised explosive device was detonated in a house with resettled refugees in Sweden. The explosion was linked to 3 men from the Swedish organization, the Nordic Resistance Movement. The local police were able to quickly identify the terrorists. They were revealed to be 2 Russian citizens and 1 Swedish citizen. All 3 had undergone military training in the aforementioned partisan camp. Here's a photo from their training, Fighters of the Northern Resistance Movement, or the abbreviated SDS. As it was established during the investigation, they were planning a series of terrorist attacks across Sweden. SDS is a neo-Nazi group that also operates in Finland, Denmark, Norway and Iceland. Here's a rare photo where Stanislav Vorobyov is addressing members of the Northern Movement. The head of the Russian imperial movement, who owns the partisan military camp, is where all the aforementioned militants received their military training. Вышеперечисленные боевики.
Мы помним, что наши предки всегда возвращали свои территории назад. Это было всегда и в 19 веке, и в 17-16 веке. Всегда мы территории, населенные русским народом, мы возвращали. Мы объединимся. Поэтому слава России!
I want this video to be viewed by as many Europeans as possible. It's important for them, just as it is for Ukrainians, to clearly recognize the goals of the Russian world's advocates. Their means for achieving these goals are war, occupation and terror. If you consider the scope of their network, which has enveloped Europe and other parts of the globe, it becomes apparent that Ukraine is merely the first stage. This is the subject of our discussion. The video shows neo-Nazis from other nations who have experienced the partisan military camp. The German magazine Focus, after conducting a series of investigations, asserts that German right-wing radicals from the NDP and the Third Way learned in Russia how to handle explosive weaponry. The connections are indeed traceable. The Russian imperial movement participated in the demonstrations of the aforementioned parties in Dortmund, Germany, which it did not hide at all. However, the Russian Federation's activities are not limited to formation. They're forming combat cells because their plans are far more extensive. The ideological indoctrination of the German right is carried out through a network of large media resources. A notable example of this is the case with the German journalist Manuel Ochsenreiter. At different times, he led or wrote for newspapers that were the voice of the right-wing movement. In 2018, Ochsenreiter was suspected of organizing the arson of the Hungarian Cultural Center, located in the Ukrainian city of Uzhgorod. The provocation was intended to incite tensions between Budapest and Kiev, as they planned to blame the Ukrainians for the arson. However, the three detainees who set the fire turned out to be Polish citizens. They confessed that they had contact with Ochsenreiter and were supposed to receive 1,500 euros from him for their act of terrorism.
Поистине международный скандал в российских СМИ ажиотажа не вызвал.
Один из поляков, которых судят за поджог венгерского культурного центра в Ужгороде, назвал заказчика.
Михаил П. заявил в суде, что Мануэль Оксенрайтер пообещал ему 1500 евро за подбор исполнителей.
An important detail, as the investigation indicates, two of the detained Poles were members of the Polish neo-fascist organization Falang, the third far-left Smena party. Yes, don't be surprised, the left, but more on that a little later.
Но об этом чуточку попозже.
Members of the Phalanx, one of their symbols being two crossed Kalashnikov assault rifles, took part in the fighting in eastern Ukraine on the side of pro-Russian separatists. In a rare photo, Denis Pushilin, the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the head of the Nazi Polish organization Falang Bartaj Becker, as they say, Donbass is fighting the fascists. But here it is important to understand that Russia operates on several planes at once. The organization of terrorist cells and the training of militants is only the first level. Such organizations operate literally throughout Europe and the United States. At the conditional second level, propagandists and ideologists operate, such as Ochsenreiter, who created the German Euro Center in Berlin. Research, it was this organization that promoted the narratives necessary for the Kremlin, primarily supporting the German Alternative for Germany party, which is currently already in the Bundestag and advocates stopping arms supplies to Ukraine.
Прекращение поставок оружия Украине.
Moreover, Ochsenreiter was a referent for Bundestag deputy Markus Frohnmeier, who is a member of the ADG, but after the German prosecutor's office opened a criminal case against the propagandist for organizing. Well, in Ukraine he left for Russia, never mind.
Догадайтесь, в Россию.
Well, Ochsenreiter's second accomplice, the Polish Mateusz Sayakowski, with whom they established the German Center for Eurasian Studies, was imprisoned in Poland for quite some time on charges of spying for Russia, and the charge was far from groundless. In 2015, Mati formed the Smena political party in Poland, which is again left-wing, and Bartaj Becker, the aforementioned head of the neo-Nazi organization Falang, became the deputy of the party. Fighters were recruited who were later sent to Ukrainian Donbass. So, you see how the scheme works. At the very bottom of the pyramid, there's a power wing of right-wing radical militants. Some went through training camps in Russia, some even took part in the aggression against Ukraine. There are ideologists who promote the necessary narratives. They are the link with the next level, with politicians who, in one way or another, promote the Kremlin's agenda. Let's look at a concrete example.
На конкретном примере.
Tutaj za mną koledzy dają wyraz tego, że jest to protest.
Yes, since November 6th, a group of Polish carriers has been protesting on the Polish-Ukrainian border, blocking the passage of critical cargo for Ukraine. Rafał Makler, leader of the Lublin branch of the Confederation Party, organized the action. Its founder is Janusz Korwin-Mikke, who personally met with Sergei Aksyonov, the head of the occupied Crimea's administration, as well as Robert Vinitsky. Before going into politics, Robert led an organization. Polish Youth, as you understand, is a nationalist and legal organization. It was with this organization that Bartosz Becker, the head of the infamous radical neo-Nazi organization Falang, started his journey. Robert Vinitsky himself advocates to stop aid to Ukraine. In reality, the Kremlin's involvement can be regularly traced in the protests of the Polish right against Kiev. So, in 2017, Ukrainian hackers from the investigative group Inform attacked link to all materials in
В описании. Была взломана почта некоего Александра Усовского.
Uzovsky, who positioned himself on federal Russian channels as an expert on Poland in particular. His correspondence with the infamous deputy of the State Duma of the Russian Federation, Konstantin Zatulin, was revealed. Next, I quote one of the letters. Yesterday, my guys from the OVP held negotiations with the leadership of the PSL. The parliamentary party traditionally participates in the SEMAs. The PSL is ready to include candidates from the OVP on its electoral lists, which is permitted. To give the pro-Russian party, the OVP in the Sejm held 12 rallies in support of Novorossiya and against the Kiev Hota. Or on the 5th of March, my guys from the OVP together with Korwin, yes, I mean the same Korwin-Mikke, the founder of the Confederation Party, whose members are now blocking the border with Ukraine, as they say the circle has closed. I read further, they are planning to hold a rally against Ukrainian aggression in Donbass, and on March 18th, a rally for Russian aggression. The Crimea issue price is between 300 to 400 euros.
Цена вопроса 3-4 тысячи евро.
Yes, don't be surprised by such modest prices. The rallies that actually took place on the scheduled dates weren't large scale. What's different here is the frequency of such actions. It is constant ongoing work. We now need to organize the farmers who are supposedly losing significant income due to Ukrainian grain carriers.
Украинских перевозчиков зерна. Вашему
Krzysztofinsky, a member of the Confederation Party and a major agrarian, is at your service. He will easily gather the required amount supposedly. There are dissatisfied. Here's a picture. Year 2023. A protest at the Ukrainian embassy. Krzysztof Tolwinsky and Mateusz Siakorski, who was accused of spying for Russia, were released on large bail. But don't think Russia's main task is organizing strikes to complicate Ukraine's logistics, although it's extremely urgent now. The fact that no one has yet organized large counteractions in Warsaw with demands shows to limit the proof that the Poles do not realize the scale of the threat to themselves.
Угрозы для себя.
Нас начали напрягать вагнеровцы. Просятся на Запад, разрешите нам. Я говорю, вам зачем на Запад туда? Ну, и втихую мы же контролируем, что происходит. Ну, сходим на экскурсию в Варшаву и Жешув. Конечно, я держу их в центре, как договорились в Беларусь. Не хотелось бы туда их передислоцировать, потому что у них настроения плохие. И надо отдать должное, они знают, что происходит вокруг союзного государства. Но это так, штрих.
I understand that some may even laugh at Lukashenko's words and Putin's cunning silence, but this is nothing more than a clown show. Only the war in Ukraine began with the same farce, with the same insinuations, with the same smirks, don't forget.
С тех же ухмылок. Не забывайте.
So now let's focus in. The same Alexander Usovsky outlines Russia's main objectives in yet another leaked letter. The situation in Slovakia may prove interesting. Based on the results of the parliamentary elections, it can be assumed that in case of an exit from, at least 45 to 50% of citizens would vote for NATO. Even the sheer fact of holding such a referendum would be the first nail in the coffin of the alliance. The most interesting thing is which party Usovsky proposes to back, namely the People's Party Our Slovakia. It is also a right-wing party led by the openly neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic Marian Kotleba, who advocates a radical solution to this issue. Naturally, the radical supports Slovakia's exit from NATO. He hangs a banner. Here is a photograph of Kotleba at one of the marches. Yes, that's right, Vladimir Putin, who accuses everyone around him of fascism, sponsors, trains, and aids neo-Nazi organizations throughout Europe. Truly, Winston Churchill was right. The fascists of the future will call themselves anti-fascists. In general, I recommend you follow the link and read all the reports that Usovsky compiled. There, the extent of bribery of all the so-called fighters for the Russian world becomes clear. Of course, you might argue that such work by Russian agents of influence doesn't yield tangible results. Sweden will soon join NATO. Finland joined the alliance yesterday, but at the same time the pro-Russian party is blocking the border with Ukraine, leaving people fighting for their survival alone with the army. As for Slovakia, you understand the situation with the occupier.
Вопреки всем данным социологов, которые прогнозировали победу с уверенным отрывом партии «Прогрессивная Словакия», после обработки более 99% бюллетеней результаты оказались совсем иными. Победила популистская партия «Направление социальная демократия» евроскептика Роберта Фицо. Она набрала 24% голосов.
I want to clarify something. I'm not asserting that Robert Fico, who better known as the Prime Minister of Slovakia, is merely a puppet of Moscow, faithfully executing all of Putin's orders. No, it doesn't work that way. Russia wields influence through its pawns, be them ideologues, opinion leaders, or radical activists, stress points that eventually solidify into genuine political influence in the country. Indeed, the rising popularity of right-wing populists across Europe, in Germany, Sweden, or the Netherlands, it's undoubtedly a consequence of the short-sighted immigration policies of provisional left liberals. But you'd be gravely mistaken if you began seeing Russia as simply a defender of traditional values, and Putin as a leader prepared to stand up for them. You'd be misunderstanding if you considered this the secret to Moscow forging links with European right-wing political parties, given, as I previously mentioned. The Kremlin maintains ties with both radical right and left wings. This will become even more evident if you continue to watch this video. After all, the Kremlin isn't interested in protecting traditional values. What is traditional about dropping air bombs on a shelter with children? Putin is interested in destabilization and chaos, since it's this chaos that allows him to achieve his desired results. Isn't it Russia, after all, that uses migrants as a hybrid weapon against the European Union? In 2021, thousands of refugees were brought to the borders of Poland through the Russian Federation of Belarus.
Происходило через целый ряд фирм в мессенджере Telegram, где им обещали за небольшую сумму релокацию в страны.
Destined for countries in the European Union. This is a well-calculated and, I emphasize, consistently enforced policy. Dozens of organizations in Syria, Iraq, Congo and Cameroon offer an easy passage to the EU through Russia and Belarus. Just that, in 2021, at the border with Poland, we saw an intensification of this plan. But let me stress, this happened before and is happening after the start of a full-scale conflict. Going to Ukraine, why do you think Finland is now closing its border with Russia? It's precisely because of the sudden influx of migrants from Africa and the Middle East. In other words, Moscow is intentionally creating a migration crisis. Finnish border guards have noted that the transportation of migrants from Syria, Iraq, Yemen and Somalia is happening systematically and centrally. In other words, Russia fuels right-wing radical sentiments in Europe through neo-Nazi groups, while at the same time sending in illegal migrants to the European Union. You must admit that's a clever plan. Even the president of Belarus has admitted that this is a planned tactic, openly stating that the planning comes from the Russians, specifically the Kadyrovites.
И в частности, кадыровцы.
Но здесь работали проводники из России. И спасибо чеченцам, вот уже организованные люди. Они самые организованные здесь были, организовывая поток. Сейчас они...
И они помогали преодолеть границу.
Они помогали здесь, с Минска, людям попадать на границу. Возможно, и преодолевать границу.
So, Russia's hybrid war against the West is in full swing. It's challenging to deem it as overly successful, but nonetheless, Moscow has an advantage over world capitals. Specifically, the speed of decision-making in authoritarian Russia relies on the will of a single person on Putin's will. Meanwhile, the United West requires collective consent for specific actions. Viktor Orban alone can block financial aid from the entire European Union. This is another demonstrative example of Moscow's influence on significant European politicians. Look, Viktor Orban declared, "We don't want to become the most cheerful barrack of Gazprom. The government is moving towards dependence on Russia. Hungary is under threat of reclassification into the sphere of interests of the Russian Federation." That's a strong statement, you must admit, but it was said in 2007. Yes, at that time Viktor Orban was a different politician. His journey to Russia in 2009 changed him. But what could have happened there that the rhetoric of the future prime minister dramatically altered? It's straightforward.
Все просто. В 2004 году
In 2004 in Hungary, a man named Dietmar Klaudon, a left-wing extremist and a member of the radical organization ERAF, which had been conducting terrorist attacks in Germany since the 70s, was arrested for selling an explosive device.
на тот момент США.
ERAF's main goal was to create a socialist revolution in Germany. As you can imagine, their activities were coordinated by Stasi, the KGB branch in GDR. According to a political magazine, it was a meeting place for a militant. ERAF was based in Dresden, where Vladimir Putin was stationed at that time. There's a high chance he supervised ERAF's members, aiding them with all the necessary resources. Actually, when the arrested Dietmar Klaudon was interviewed by investigator Maria Gayson, he claimed he personally met with Vladimir Putin in those times. But the main point is not about this, but the fact is that Dietmar, while living in Hungary and involved in contract killings, always worked to document meetings where he was transferred money or he transferred money himself, executing the instructions of his immediate superior. By that time, Dietmar was employed under Semyon Mogilevich, who is one of the most notorious figures in the Russian mafia and an organizer of the Solntsevsky group. Klaudon will discuss this in court, showing a folder with a built-in hidden camera that he used to collect incriminating evidence on all his guests. So, according to Dietmar himself, one of the guests who came to see him was Viktor Orban.
Виктор Орбан.
Это пожертвование на избирательную кампанию в размере 1 миллиона немецких марок было направлено господину Орбану.
Денежные переводы всегда происходили в его квартире.
Yes, we don't know whether Dietmar Klaudon was an agent for the KGB and FSB or if he was collecting blackmail for himself, but based on his previous ties with Russian intelligence, the Kremlin has a video recording of the current Prime Minister of Hungary. This is the only explanation for the drastic change in Viktor Orban's rhetoric after visiting Moscow. This is the chain of events. That is, Putin has the following cards in the Hungarian deck: a prime minister who has damaging information against him. The marginal ideologist in the photo is Martin Dzsandosy, the head of the notorious Jobbik party, together with Alexander Dugin, and Jobbik itself, of course, is a right-wing radical party within which there are Russian agents. So in 2022, the Hungarian prosecutor's office issued an arrest warrant for Belikovka, a member of the Jobbik party. He was accused of spying for the Russian Federation. His first immediate task was, quote, to undermine the institutions of the European Union and to support Russian interests. Kovac himself denied his guilt so intensely that he left for Russia, where he lives to this day. But I'm explaining all this so that you understand how vulnerable the West is to authoritarian regimes and how easy it is to disrupt the workings of a large bureaucratic machine with the help of influential agents. In reality, Orban alone is enough to prevent the European Union from functioning normally.
Не мог нормально функционировать.
Министры иностранных дел и дипломаты Евросоюза выступили единым фронтом в поддержку Украины перед лицом российской агрессии. Однако на их встрече в Киеве не удалось разблокировать предоставление ей военной помощи в размере 500 миллионов евро. На выделение этих средств наложила вето Венгрия.
Yes, Putin is attempting to reshape the entire international relations system to benefit himself, where borders could be adjusted using tanks. He exploited the weaknesses of democratic systems. Yet, democracy has both its drawbacks and strengths, the primary one being freedom of speech. Naturally, I'm creating this video not just for you, my valued subscribers. Particularly if you're watching my channel, things must already be pretty clear to you. I'm hoping that with your assistance, this video will be seen. It will be spread by those who can influence Western politicians, those who provide these politicians with legitimacy, that is, ordinary citizens of the European Union, the United States, and other democratic countries. It's to them that I'm trying to explain that a hybrid war is already being waged against them. I hope I'm being persuasive.
The main thing is that you help me disseminate this material. Now, many pro-Ukrainian speakers are beating themselves up over delays, arms supplies, and political intrigues within Western states. They criticize Zelensky and reflect on how they should have communicated with the West earlier, but do nothing to correct the situation, even though we have that opportunity. We need to consolidate our information forces to make things clearer. From the war to Europeans and Americans, they are not observers in the Russian-Ukrainian war, they are its participants.
They became participants long before the 24th of February 2022. Once again, politicians in democratic countries carry out the will of their voters, and this is our trump card. This means that we need to convince voters, that is ordinary citizens, that it is in their interest for Ukraine to win because it will be their victory. But of course, for this to happen, it is extremely important that they hear or see the arguments from this video. Therefore, I ask you first of all to distribute the video as much as possible. Wherever you can, set a goal for yourself to send it to everyone you know, especially if you know citizens of the European Union, USA, Canada, and so on. Arm Ukraine as soon as possible. Armukraineasap in the title of the video is left in order to declare the main goal of this video, namely to achieve the fastest possible supply of weapons from the United West, because of indecision, the best sons and daughters of Ukraine die every day. They stood up to defend, as you understand, not only their country, but also all those who are to the west of its border.
I urge all public opinion leaders, bloggers, journalists, politicians to start using this hashtag so that it gains attention in the West. In every post, in every publication, I ask anyone with some form of information resource to reach out to their audience, explain to them why it is so crucial to arm Ukraine, why it's vital to arm Ukraine as soon as possible if you need to convince your audience of this need. In terms of assistance to Ukraine, take these above arguments. Explain to them that Putin is not going to stop. Regimes like the ones now in Kremlin only increase their appetite. Is this not clear to any rational person who has read a history textbook?
Который читал учебник по истории.
Усвойте вы в конце концов урок! Сколько еще диктаторов нужно успокоить, ублажить, осыпать привилегиями, прежде чем вы поймете истину? Невозможно договориться с тигром, если твоя голова у него в пасти!
I'm asking all my colleagues to assist me with this small initiative. I don't need publicity. There's no need to mention me specifically, but I request that you all strategically influence the Western information space. We need to get through to the Americans, the Germans, the Poles, the Austrians, the British, and so forth. It's crucial right now to ask their governments to provide assistance to the Ukrainian army. If you know any English-speaking bloggers on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, please make a request. Ask them to join the armukraineasap campaign and explain to their audience the importance of supporting Ukraine. This is not about Kyiv maintaining control over territories, nor about Ukrainian or Russian language in Mariupol schools. It's about world order, a large war already taking place on their territory. I ask all of you, my dear friends and subscribers, to use #armukraineasap in the comments if you have a serious information resource. So you need to clarify to your subscribers that the Ukrainian soldier today is holding a front line, beyond which is not only Ukraine. If they fall, this front line could move to the street where a citizen of Poland, Moldova, Germany or France lives.
Какая из стран может тоже пойти по этому пути? Киргизия, Казахстан, вокруг России.
Сейчас на эту роль приглядывают Молдову, прежде всего потому, что смогли поставить достаточно специфическими методами далеко не свободно-демократическими, во главе страны президента, которая просто рвется, сама рвется в НАТО. Она имеет румынское гражданство, она готова объединяться с Румынией и вообще готова практически на все.
Of course, someone might argue that my speech is nothing more than a horror story, since Europe is sheltered by the NATO umbrella, much like an army stuck near Avdiivka could potentially menace an entire bloc. Well, from the very start, I allowed myself to enhance the statements of the head of the National Security Bureau of Poland, who undoubtedly has more information than I do, suggesting that a NATO territory invasion will happen if Ukraine falls, because if Ukraine gives in, Putin's most belligerent army will be unleashed.
После украинской, закаленная и слаженная в боях, которых свет не видел с начала Второй мировой, плюс российский ВПК с каждым месяцем лишь набирает обороты.
Month by month, the Russian army has been learning from past mistakes, and most significantly, it has mastered modern warfare. The newest technologies have dramatically altered the war landscape, changing the power structure and balance of forces. We've all witnessed the impact of inexpensive first-person view drones.
Сажают современную артиллерию за миллионы долларов, а хорошо закопавшегося в землю солдата не выковырять ни F-35, ни вертолетами Apache. И вот представьте, что в один день части без опознания...
Now imagine, one day forces without identification might enter Baltic countries' territories, as the Polish head of national security, Jacek Sewerera, insists. It would be unmarked, because as noted above, the Kremlin has been waging hybrid wars for many decades, therefore it's not unreasonable. It's not far-fetched to think that an invasion into, say, Latvia might not come with a formal declaration of war or other legal formalities. There might be disturbances triggered by unknown parties in eastern Latvia, which has a sizable ethnic Russian population. Upon capturing administrative buildings, these individuals might ask Russian troops to support a fledgling independent Latvian People's Republic. Hasn't this already happened in recent history? Remind me, what would the United States and NATO do in these circumstances? What if, at the same time, another round of bickering breaks out in Washington between Republicans and Democrats and they can't agree on some document? What if troops advanced into Belarusian territory under the Belarusian flag, and Moscow legally remains uninvolved in the war?
Юридически останется вообще не вовлеченной.
Minsk will be targeted, but the decision-making center will clearly not be there. I want Europeans to understand this. Russia has lost.
В войне с Украиной больше 300 тысяч человек, и это никак не остановило агрессию. Готов ли Путин потерять?
Is Putin ready to lose as much in a hypothetical war with the Baltic countries? Certainly. And is Europe ready to sustain comparable losses to combat aggression?
Отражение агрессии.
And if Hungary, a NATO member, starts hindering the bureaucratic process, how long will it take the trained, embittered Russian army to reach the Polish border?
Российской армии, чтобы выйти на границы с Польшей. Понимаете?
You see, everything in Ukraine, he has shattered the international relations system. Nothing is holding him back. On the contrary, he is diligently paving the way to accomplish his plan.
Для реализации своего плана
I tried to illustrate this today.
Постарался продемонстрировать.
Сепаратисты всего мира объединятся в Москве в следующем месяце. Сепаратисты из Северной Ирландии, Шотландии, Испании, Италии, Калифорнии, Техаса, Гавайев и Пуэрто-Рико будут среди тех, кто посетит санкционированную Кремлем и финансируемую им конференцию, организованную российским антиглобалистским движением.
Yes, separatism is indeed the main weapon of Russia, or to be precise, of the Russian special forces. Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, DPR, LPR. These are effective ways for Moscow to impose its will on another state. And it's not only limited to the post-Soviet space. For instance, the Republika Srpska is preparing for an independence referendum, as announced by its president Milorad Dodik in July this year. Remember, do not confuse it with Serbia. Republika Srpska is separate. It is part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which in turn is just a few steps away from joining NATO. Undoubtedly, Putin's aim is to prevent the state from joining the alliance, and the only tool available to him to achieve this goal is, of course, separatism. In fact, in 2014, Bosnia and Herzegovina was not so far from repeating the fate of Ukraine. In that year, elections were held in Republika Srpska, and with a marginal difference. The earlier mentioned pro-Russian candidate, Milorad Dodik, emerged victorious. He beat his opponent by only 1%, but Russia played it safe in advance and was prepared for a scenario where Dodik's opponent would win. So just before the elections, there were sightings of unusual people in Cossack hats on the streets of Banja Luka and the capital of Republika Srpska. The journalists, trying to determine who they were told by their leader that they were dancers. Although there was no dance festival planned during those days, and the key person interacting with the journalists was Nikolai Diakonov, who had participated in the fighting in Donbass in 2014.
Участие в боевых действиях на Донбассе.
Here he is, standing in the same photo with Sokov and Borodey, right next to the overt neo-Nazi Melchikov.
Открытого неонациста Мельчакова.
Я прям говорю, я нацист. Можно руку вскинуть.
Of course, in 2014, Republika Srpska didn't have to do what Moscow did in Donbass, as the Kremlin's preferred candidate Milorad Dodik won. But one can only imagine how the Russian militants would have reacted if the election results had been different. I mention all this as an example of how relatively easy it is to stir up a war in Europe, specifically in its most volatile regions. To claim that the European Union is immune would be foolish. Foolish. This is why I mentioned the Global Separatists Congress in Moscow earlier. It's an openly held event, taking place under the guise of anti-globalization movement. It attracts a large number of representatives from different countries and unrecognized republics, from Lebanon and Transnistria to Catalonia and the United States. Indeed, the executive director of the Texas National Movement, Nate Smith, who once headed the organization supporting this, attended the forum, the secession of Texas from the United States. Of course, one might think that these are fringe figures who organize conferences, congresses, and discuss various topics, but as I said earlier, Russia operates on several fronts simultaneously. This is Matthew Heinbach, the founder of the Traditionalist Worker Party. Despite his nationalist views, Matthew advocates for the complete disintegration of the United States and wants to facilitate the creation of numerous small states within its territory, supporting Iran, North Korea, and others at the same time. Once again, the Kremlin is not establishing ties based on supporting everyone upholding conservatism and traditional values. Rather, they're aiming at destabilization again and again. Note that Matthew, who took part in the storming of the Capitol in 2021, yes, that's him in the photograph inside the building, has close ties with the already infamous Russian imperial movement. In the photo, Matthew is waving a Russian flag, alongside with Stanislav Shevchuk, a member of Reed. In the next picture, it's Shevchuk himself, the leader of the Russian imperial movement stand, Stanislav Vorobyov, and members of the Polish neo-Nazi organization Falanga. They took part in the conflict in Ukraine's Donbass, as I mentioned earlier. By the way, Shevchuk is one of the ideologues of the Russian imperial movement, and he frequently attends various party meetings worldwide. Here we have Shevchuk delivering a lecture in Spain to members of the Spanish right-wing party ND. Now, it's unsurprising that the Spanish law enforcement has accused the neo-Nazis of sending letter bombs in 2023 with Moscow's assistance. The letters were not only sent to the Ukrainian embassy in Spain, but also to key politicians who condemned Russia's aggression, as well as to the weapons manufacturer Instalaza, which plans to supply arms to Ukraine. It's evident that this was an attempt by radicals in cahoots with the Kremlin to intimidate anyone who supported Kiev.
If Putin takes Ukraine, he won't stop there. It's important to see the long run here. He's going to keep going. He's made that pretty clear. If Putin attacks a NATO ally, if he keeps going, and then he attacks a NATO ally, where we've committed as a NATO member that we defend every inch of NATO territory, then we'll have something that we don't seek and that we don't have today. American troops fighting Russian troops. American troops fighting Russian troops if he moves into other parts of NATO.
Yes, this is how the Russian special services work, creating radical cells regardless of being left or right, financing ideologists, fringe groups, separatists, militants, whose actions ultimately accumulate into the political capital necessary for the Kremlin. All of this may seem insignificant now due to the small number of openly pro-Russian leaders in the West. But understand, Russia does not always aim to bring the most favorable president to power. Rather, they aim to establish a puppet in power in a democratic country. The goal, as I have already repeated many times, is destabilization, constant weakening, fueling separatist sentiments, with the expectation that at one moment one of the recruited activists will end up, say, in the captured parliament of another state, and will stage a provocation that will serve as a trigger for sparking the violence of a large war. That's exactly how it works, and that's exactly how it happened in Ukraine. You're mistaken if you think that Putin won't try to do something similar in other countries.
Что-то подобное в других странах.
Но я не думаю, что счастье придет в дом к тем, кто проводит такую политику. Ну, я не знаю сейчас сколько, но в Латвии, по-моему, 40% было русскоязычного населения. Наверняка и сейчас немало. Если они будут проводить такую политику в отношении людей, которые хотели жить в той или иной стране, работали там, создавали какие-то блага для этой страны, и с ними будут так по-свински обращаться, то в конце концов они сами с таким свинством и столкнутся внутри своих стран.
In fact, I could only shed light on a small portion of the operations conducted by Russian secret services, operations aimed at destabilizing different countries. Most importantly, these are the cases that one might trace by means of various public mentions in the press or through photos acquired from open or private archives.
Или из личных архивов.
The true extent of Russian world integration into the West is tough to determine. You might remember I made a brief video about how Gazprom, before launching a full-scale invasion, sponsored major football championships. Contrary to initial impression, this action by Gazprom didn't seem to make sense. It's not a retail company that needs advertising to increase its customer base.
Клиентскую базу.
The Russian gas company didn't need to compete with other similar firms because there were no competitors. Back then, I explained that such irrational advertising and sponsorship of various clubs made it possible to gain access to European politicians and also to win the support of football fans in EU countries. The Gazprom logo on the jerseys of the Cervena Star Football Club is not just advertising, it's an opportunity to engage with
базой с ультрасами Цервены Звезды, которые сперва вывешивали флаги непризнанных.
First they showcased the unrecognized DPR, then they went to Donbass to kill Ukrainians. So let me reiterate this thought again. Russia's war with the West has been ongoing for a long time, and Putin, through his representatives, openly says that it will continue.
Что она будет продолжаться.
Россия и Путин во главе России возглавили такой процесс тектонических перемен, тектонических сдвигов во всех аспектах глобальной жизни. Эти процессы начались, они необратимы.
Putin has led the process of tectonic changes, understanding that these tectonic changes cannot be confined only to Ukraine, or more specifically, to a few regions of Ukraine. No, Putin will not stop until either he emerges victorious or until he is halted. Yes, now Ukrainian heroes are hindering his path, and it would be a betrayal for the West to leave them without support at a critical moment. The most
момент, самым
a terrible betrayal, because currently the Ukrainian front is a thin red line protecting European cities from the fate of cities like Mariupol, Volnovakha, Bucha, Marinka, Izium, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and dozens of other cities where Russia has exerted influence. So Ukraine ASAP.
Я уже много раз говорил об этом и могу повторить еще раз. Я считаю, что вообще украинцы и русские – это вообще один народ. Дробление ни к чему хорошему не приводит. Он ослабляет просто этнос. Я не считаю, что украинский народ является недружественным. Нет, ничего подобного. Это мы единое целое. Как урегулировать отношения и кто останется у власти, кто не останется. Дело не в персоналиях. Дело в отношении к людям. Мы хотим, чтобы на всей территории Украины, в том числе и на Донбассе, был мир и процветание. Мы заинтересованы в этом, потому что Украина остается одним из наших крупнейших партнеров.
Nothing unites people like a common enemy. Nothing divides people like different goals. I understand that delays in arms supplies to Kyiv may be associated with the decision taken in world capitals to freeze the war. And I, as a person who considers human life to be the highest value, have no right to oppose freezing. That is why I want to emphasize that my call to citizens of democratic countries to arm Ukraine as soon as possible is in no way connected with the desire to continue bloodshed, because Ukraine is losing the best of the best every day. At the same time, I understand that even when going to negotiations with Russia, Ukraine is obliged to come to them fully armed and not alone. Behind it, there must be a united, decisive, consolidated West, which will make it clear and unambiguous to Moscow that the price for continuing the war will be colossal. That's the point of this video, Uniting for Peace. And not only Ukraine needs this, I hope I was able to convey this. Now Putin's friend, Nicolas Maduro, can start a war in Guyana. This could lead to another tragedy, to new bloodshed, to a manifold increase in the crowd of refugees to the US border. And if this happens, I want you to keep in mind that such cynical and criminal actions by Maduro only became possible because of the indecisiveness of the West, because, as I say, a murderer usually turns into a maniac when he loses his fear of punishment. Arm Ukraine, ESA, I've said everything. Now it's up to you to decide whether to be or быть или